In the culmination of the way of integral knowledge, Sri Aurobindo describes how we arrive at the unity of the aims set before themselves by the three paths of knowledge, works, and devotion. Each of these, as it reaches its peak, as if includes the results of the other two. Whichever be our starting point, eventually we are drawn to fulfill all three paths. As a quick recapitulation, he says, knowledge aims at the realization of the true self-existence. Works at the realization of the divine conscious will which secretly governs all works. Devotion at the realization of the bliss which enjoys as the lover all beings and all existences. So the three things that are realized: Sat, Chit, Tapas and Ananda. Each therefore aims at possessing Satchidananda through one or other aspect of his triune divine nature. And as we saw in our explorations, ultimately everything in the universe is Satchidananda. You may approach it through one of these three aspects, but eventually whatever your starting point, as you uncover through layers the underlying Satchidananda in each thing, behind each form, you discover him in all three aspects. If this is true of every single object, even if you take a single flower, you discover its triune facets. This is equally true of the whole universe. When you approach the realization of the divine Satchidananda, you realize him not only beyond the universe but also in the universe and as the universe. You discover this triune aspect. And in the following part of the text, closing this chapter, Sri Aurobindo describes in detail how the path of knowledge leads to the realization of the Sat, but cosmically as well as individually. Then in the next paragraph, the path of works leads to the realization of the Chit and the action of Chit in the cosmos and individually. And in the third paragraph, which we will see today, how it leads to the realization of the all blissful, the Ananda aspect, which is now filling this whole cosmos, both cosmically and individually. So these three in sequence, these three paragraphs, sequentially build an experience. In the first one, describing the Sat, He lays a framework. In the second, we see in that framework, which is the Sat, which is existence, we do not see movement. In the second paragraph, the consciousness aspect emerging, we see the movement filled around the Sat. And in the third, it is in the movement that we discover the play of the bliss. Now, when you describe it in this way, as three layers which are uncovered of a single experience, you will notice a very close similarity to the human body design. In the biology class, you do not start with the nerves. You start with that which gives to the body its rigidity, its foundation, its basis. And inevitably, the biology teacher will uncover the skeleton. And we see the skeleton with the pieces of bones tied together, hanging. The most rigid part, which makes possible our being able to stand erect, to be able to act, to be able to push. If the bones were not rigid, you could not push an object, you could not lift an object, you could not do anything meaningfully. Upon that, which is like a foundation, we consider the things which make for the movement of the bones, the muscles. And so you as if fill a layer on top, which is the dynamic aspect. The movements and all the possibilities of the movements can now be explored. And then on top of that, you put the third layer, which would include not only the skin cover, which would make for the final appearance of the human being, but with the skin, the nervous system, which underlying not only can guide the movement, but much more than that, it is that which brings the sensation of the movement and the sensation of the world and the enjoyment of it all. Very interestingly, these three layers convey exactly the same relationship of the Sat, Chit, Tapas and the Ananda aspect. And so when we read the description of the way of knowledge and its culmination, you see this sense of the static like a foundation. By knowledge, we arrive always at our true, eternal, immutable being, unchanging. The self-existent which every eye in the universe obscurely represents through many layers. And we abrogate difference in the great relation, Soham, I am He, while we arrive also at our identity with all other beings. So in this image, you see the underlying Sat, true, eternal, immutable being, covering or containing the entire cosmos and supporting each form individually. And since each is the same one, there is an underlying unity. We experience our identity with all beings. You see, this framework has no sense of movement, no sense of change. But if there was not this stable foundation, there could not be movement, there could not be play. Any play must have something underlying which is stable. In the game of football, everybody is running around, the ball is being kicked around, but the goalposts have to be fixed, they can't be shifting around. The boundaries of the game are set, they can't change. Any game you set, you will find something has to be there which sets the framework in which the whole movement can take place. And so this, which is realized through the path of knowledge, is the Sat, out of which, within which emerges the consciousness, the Chit, the awareness which is this existence, and the force of that awareness. And this is what is discovered by the path of works. Except that, through the path of integral knowledge, he says, at the same time the integral knowledge gives us awareness of that infinite existence as the conscious force. So all that we have held so far, immediately now we see in it emerging conscious force. Not only underlying backdrop, which was Sat, is also conscious force pouring into the universe, but each individual, each form supported by its individual I is now growing in consciousness, expressing consciousness. And both on the cosmic scale, on the individual scale, what does that conscious force do? The conscious force which creates and governs the worlds and manifests itself in their works. It is creating, it is guiding the movement and expressing itself progressively. That means in each thing, the conscious force has formed the flower, guides the unfolding of the petals of the flower, and as the flower blooms, the conscious force reveals itself more and more. Where in the form of the bud, the conscious force is least seen, in the full bloom it is most seen, and then when it fades again, the conscious force withdraws or changes form of appearance. And so it is everywhere, cosmically and individually. But what is this conscious force? It is conscious, so you cannot anymore say it, you have to say He. It reveals the self-existent in His universal conscious will as the Lord, the Ishvara, the one who rules, who inhabits, who enjoys. It enables us to unite our will with His, to realize His will in the energies of all existences, and to perceive the fulfillment of these energies of others as part of our own universal self-fulfillment. We read this last time, but just to recapitulate, because it sets the base for the third step. So here we see not only conscious force, but guiding that action of the force is His will. And we unite our individual will with His will. The moment we discover this is what His will is, what would be the point of you saying, but I want to do differently? When you realize your innate existence is He, what would be the point of saying, I am He, but I should do different from He? Immediately as the Sat aspect is realized, your will also must align with His Chit, energy, will. And so individually you unite with His will, but also you see how everyone else and everything is finally serving His will. Now this is part of a larger discussion which takes place in the Yoga of Divine Works, which we have not studied in detail yet. But he explains there how, even as each individual tries to fulfill his own individual ego and desire and personal will, whatever it may be at that moment, in a fancy or a whim, unknown to him, he is actually fulfilling the universal nature's will. How is that? Because what we don't realize is, the thing which made our nature was that universal nature. The thing which put inside us this impulse to do what I want, to fulfill my desire, was actually that universal will or desire. So if you can call it she as nature, Mother Nature, as she forms you out of her substance, she fills into you the imprint of her intention and then leaves you free. And you start saying, I want to do, I will do, my desire, my will. I don't care what the universe wants, I don't care what you want, I will do what I. You don't realize that what you're chasing after is actually what she has secretly implanted into you. Except that, since you have not found that continuity with her will, you are fulfilling her will but a little chaotically, in a confused way. If, for example, you had to enter a dangerous space, Fukushima reactor, where there's radiation, human beings cannot enter, what do? You put a robot inside. But who created the robot? You. With what intention? With the intention of the specific task that you want to do. Except that you can only put so much intelligence into the robot as you're able to organize in a small limited framework. And so it does your task but not as effectively. What do you do then? You tie yourself to the robot electronically. You attach its cameras to your eyes, your hands' movement to its grip electronically. And then it's as if you have entered it and you do directly what you want. And then the robot fulfills itself fully. If you take this analogy now in the scope of the human being or the flower, we are like these little automatons wound up and released by nature. As long as we live by our instincts and desires and habits, we are just fulfilling what she programmed us for. Except that it's a bit limited because of the way we are functioning with our limited intelligence and capacity. And as we unite our will with the divine will, that working becomes now spontaneous, direct and complete. Almost effortless, inspired. So not only we see ourselves aligned with this, but we see in everybody how everything is fulfilling that will, even if obscurely. And so what you are doing and what they are doing is not in conflict. It is all serving one gigantic movement of the divine will. Thus, it removes the reality of strife and division and opposition and leaves only their appearance. By that knowledge, therefore, we arrive at the possibility of a divine action, a working which is personal to our nature but impersonal to our being, since it proceeds from that which is beyond our ego and acts only by its universal sanction. So we realize that we can act in the way natural to our temperament, and that means uniquely and different from everybody else. Each has a different temperament. And yet at the same time we are impersonal to that because we see that the action itself is working through everybody. We do not have a personal attachment to this one particular role. In one of the examples we took last time, in a giant battlefield, a soldier or a company of soldiers may be given an assignment which may appear to be suicidal. They know they will not come out of it alive. And yet, if they look at the larger picture, they see how their effort serves the fulfillment of the grand plan and the grand strategy. And so they accept willingly if they are conscious of that. Or intuitively they sense, well, this is needed, we do it. But there is no sense of personal loss if you live in that consciousness which is one with all. You are only fulfilling one role in a larger movement. This is seen very easily in creatures which have a collective group consciousness. Among ants, for example, we see this behavior. In certain ants which are extremely forceful, I think they're called fire ants in Africa. If they are foraging and going across the forest and they come to a patch of flowing water, the first group of ants will enter the water and stay stuck, cling inside and die, to form a bridge upon which the rest of the ants can cross. If you think about the individual ant sacrifice, you'll say, oh, poor ant. But if you see the group consciousness of the nest, the group consciousness is just doing what it needs to do to move forward. It has lost nothing, but that's the larger identity. In the human consciousness, similarly, if you are wiping the table with your hands, you rub your hand across, many cells of your fingers have just been torn off and died. If you consider the life of each individual cell, you will say, oh, what a great sacrifice they made. But if you consider that the cells themselves are only an expression or serve to fulfill the hand, then you just did what needed to be done, and it's not a sacrifice at all. In the individual consciousness, the analogy breaks down because each individual is intended to fulfill something unique. It's not like the cell which does not have a clear sense of individuality, or the ant which can easily sacrifice itself because it is not too individualized. Here we need to take into account this problem of the fulfillment of the individual as well as the cosmic fulfillment. And this is the way it happens, because you see this working which is personal to your nature but impersonal to the being, because the origin of the working is beyond your personal ego. And so the universal action is fulfilled, the individual action is fulfilled, and you have no personal attachment or reaction to the results of your work. And so we proceed in our works with equality, without bondage to works and their results, in unison with the highest, in unison with the universal, free from separate responsibility for our acts, and therefore unaffected by their reactions. This, which we have seen to be the fulfillment of the path of works, becomes thus an annex and a result of the path of knowledge. So in this paragraph, which we had read last time in great detail, you see now the picture of the universe filled now with action. Everything is movement of consciousness flowing, working, and fulfilling, revealing itself as part of the divine will, working individually and cosmically. In this image now, the third dimension is being awakened. And this is the dimension of the way of devotion, the way of love, and the bliss of the Satchidananda which is filled into this picture. And until this is done, the experience of the universe is incomplete. It is for bliss and for fulfillment of the bliss that the universe was born. And so we come to the culmination of this. The integral knowledge again reveals to us the self-existent as the all-blissful, who, as Satchidananda, manifesting the world, manifesting all beings, accepts their adoration, even as he accepts their works of aspiration and their seekings of knowledge, leans down to them and, drawing them to himself, takes all into the joy of his divine being. Knowing him as our divine self, we become one with him, as the lover and beloved become one, in the ecstasy of that embrace. Knowing him too in all beings, perceiving the glory and beauty and joy of the beloved everywhere, we transform our souls into a passion of universal delight and a wideness and joy of universal love. All this, which we shall find is the summit of the path of devotion, becomes also an annex and a result of the path of knowledge. So this is the paragraph now for deeper exploration which we take up. But you see in this big picture, as we have read through, the similar pattern that we saw in the earlier two discussions. First, that we discover the same Sat is also Ananda. Not only in the cosmic scope, manifesting Ananda in the universe as the universe, but in each individual it is the same Ananda. And then the relationship of the Ananda which is set between him and each form and the universe, and the relationships between them, that is explored. And the result of it practically is the way it transforms our life and our relationship with everything. This is the broad structure of what the paragraph reveals. But step back for a moment on the first picture we had of everything as Sat, and each individual supported by the same Sat behind the individual I. And the whole movement filled with the consciousness, force of consciousness and will, not only cosmically, but in and through each individual blooming like flowers, revealing the will and the consciousness of the divine through each center, in the whole universe. And now into this comes that same one, Sat, is also bliss. That movement of consciousness unveiling is also bliss unveiling. And then the bliss fills the whole universe. Reveals to us the self-existent as the all-blissful. A capital, blissful. The all as bliss. When he says all, the all is not just all things. It is all possibilities, including the things which could not yet be. Remember Sri Aurobindo's description of how to meditate on the Brahman. And summarizing the whole thing, he says you have to conceive of Brahman not only as everything, all forms that are, but also all that could be. Beginning with the past. Everything that was in the past and everything that could have been in the past is all included in the Brahman. And everything which is right now, everything including every form and every flower and every petal and every molecule and every atom, every subatomic particle, every virtual particle that momentarily appears and disappears, and every unformed energy flow and force, everything that is and everything that could have been which is not expressed, all included of the present, and then conceive of the future and everything that will be and everything that can be, might have been but would not be, and all this is included in the one Brahman. And this gives you a sense of the all, but it's not yet complete. Taking all this, behind that you see all that is still unmanifest which can still pour out into this all. And here you get a glimpse of the sense of the all with a capital A. So the all blissful. That means all the bliss that has manifested in the past and could have manifested but did not, all that is manifesting now and could have but did not, and all that will be and might not, and still beyond that unknowably, infinitely, unending bliss, still waiting to pour down. And this is the all blissful, which is the Sat, from which, out of which the whole cosmos flows out. So the all blissful who as Satchidananda, manifesting the world, manifesting all beings. And so in this phrase you're seeing both movements, manifesting the world and manifesting all beings, almost equivalent. The same bliss which is bursting out to manifest the whole world is also the same bliss which is manifesting each being, including each one of us, including all beings. The power behind us individually is the same power which is behind the whole universe. Because recall, we discover our I is the same as that I. Our self-existence is the same one self-existence. Our consciousness is also the same one consciousness. The same, our will is that one will, limited, fragmented. And so our consciousness and our enjoyment of the world also is that bliss, obscured through many veils, distorted in its many forms because of the distortions of our consciousness, but behind it is that same all bliss. So the all blissful who as Satchidananda, manifesting the world, manifesting all beings, accepts their adoration, even as he accepts their works of aspiration and their seekings of knowledge. So what is the relationship of that bliss? What is it doing with everything? It accepts their adoration. And where is this adoration? Am I adoring the divine bliss? I'm not conscious of it. But he says, even as he accepts their works of aspiration and their seekings of knowledge. And this gives us a clue. In the earlier discussion of the way of works, we have this very important idea that all the efforts you make, your individual will makes, consciously or unconsciously, all the effort that it makes, it's going towards something. I want this flower, I make effort to take this flower in order to decor it on my head, put it on a vase, give it to someone, or extract perfume out of it, or sell it to somebody, make money out of it. Whatever the interest or objective, the will directs an action for a particular outcome. Not realizing that actually the will has gone to fulfill this larger universal working. You see this most easily in the forest, where everything is working subconsciously. The extent of awakened awareness is limited, and so it's in a perfect balance. When the bird is attracted to eat the fruit because it is hungry, it also ends up eating the seed, and then it flies and it drops the seed somewhere else, which spreads the tree, etc. What the tree could not do in spreading its seed at a great distance, the bird is fulfilling, unknown to the bird, unknown to the tree. And it is the same with human beings. Every desire impulse we have, however narrow and individualistic it may be, is finally going to fulfill something in a small way, narrowly, obscurely, pushing forward the overall agenda of evolution. If we did nothing, then of course we would not be participating in it at all. And that's the beauty of it. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna explains, you cannot do nothing. Even the one who does nothing ends up doing something inevitably and affecting the circumstances. It famously said that the decision to not do anything is also a decision. It's a choice made consciously. Well, even if you did it unconsciously, you're still fulfilling that will. And so what we see here is one gigantic movement in which your will is going, finally fulfilling and merging into that action. Where did your will come from? In the way nature formed you, and obscurely behind layers, that original will which worked through your will, going back to its fulfillment. So what we see is everything comes from that, appears in the individual, however obscurely, and then goes back into that. In the famous verse from the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna explains that the whole movement of this universe is like one gigantic movement of homage, or the word used, translated from yajna, is sacrifice. The sense of sacrifice in English is not quite the same as yajna, but the idea is the movement of consecration, pouring into that which is greater. And everything is one gigantic movement of this consecration or sacrifice or yajna. And so he uses this phrase, one of the verse goes, Brahman is the offering being made. The one who presides over the whole movement is also Brahman. The one who is offering is Brahman, and into Brahman of fire is the offering gone. And one who dwells in this immersion of Brahman inevitably merges into Brahman. It's a very powerful verse and a clue to the form of the practice. And that is simply to become conscious that everything you do eventually goes to the divine anyway. Even if I give this flower to somebody whom I love, it is not going to the person but to the divine inhabiting the person. What is going? The divine inhabiting the flower. By whom? By the divine inhabiting within me. All you have is masks within me which do not recognize that, masks within the flower which conceal that, masks within the other which hide that. But secretly, behind the scenes, it is always from the one to the one, as one of the forms of the one, that the whole play is taking place. So, he accepts their works of aspiration. Everything you do is finally accepted by him and goes to serve him eventually, whether you are conscious of it or not. The whole universe is really offering itself in aspiration to the divine, to the Lord, to the true enjoyer. And in that movement of pouring itself into him, it grows. Each time you make that movement, there is a little bit of the revelation of the consciousness and the joy and the fulfillment of the action, and layer by layer. And this is true of the works which he accepts. It's also true of the seekings of knowledge which he accepts. Now, what is the seekings of knowledge? If you observe the nature of our working of consciousness, we are always trying to know and to apply the knowledge. So I want to know what is it that makes for the perfume of this flower, and I will now try to extract that or recreate that perfume with chemicals for whatever reason, to make money or just invent something new. But the attempt to know is an attempt to know the working of the consciousness of his being. And whatever glimpse I get adds to my growth of knowledge, which I then apply to fulfill his working. Consider what humanity has done as a result of the development of science. Science did not think of serving the divine. It discarded the divine. It tried to improve human life and comfort, whatever goals it set for itself, dominate, control, whatever it has. Eventually what it has done is this very same processes of nature which were developed over billions of years perhaps, it has taken and reapplied on a broader scale. Today, without a flower, I pull out a pocket spray and spray it in the room to create a perfume of a flower which comes out of a little bottle. It may be completely synthetic, but it mimics the perfume of the flower with a knowledge of the molecular structures and relationships of those structures to our nostrils and the perception of the brain and so on. All of that knowledge is only unveiling a glimpse of the working of the divine consciousness. And so all of our seeking for knowledge is accepted by him, and he allows himself to be revealed and allows your seeking to serve the larger revelation in the universe. The practical result is what nature could not have done on her own, or might have taken many more billion years, has now been done by human beings by using the human mind, used by whom? By nature herself, to do this. It's as if nature says, well, my methods now are a little hampered because I have to work from behind the scenes, so I create a representative in front of the scene who does what I ask it to do. And so the human mind says, oh, we are going to discover the DNA structure, we are going to improve on these crops, we are going to change the genome and improve the species, remove illnesses or add skills which were not there, and so on. Which nature would have done eventually over a few thousands or millions of years. But the same thing can be done now by a direct intervention of knowledge. What is that knowledge discovered? The working of the divine behind the scenes, exposed. Why? Because we sought him, not realizing it was him. We only reduced him to knowledge of his working. If you think about it in this way, the whole of science is nothing but an effort to realize the divine in the aspect of knowledge, in discovering his underlying reality behind layers of appearances. It is actually following the same pattern as the way of knowledge, seeking to realize the Sat behind all the flowing movement of concealments of his energies. And so, even as he accepts their works of aspirations and their seekings of knowledge, he accepts also now their adorations. And now we have a clue. And the clue is this: unknown to us, all of our adorations are really going towards Him. Every time I look at the flower and I say, oh, how beautiful this flower, how perfectly formed. Why do you want to put it in your hair? Why do you want to place it in a vase? Why do you want to offer it to the photograph or painting or idol of a form that you love and adore? Because it's beautiful. Because somehow it has something which fulfills you. Not only the beauty brings a magical character, but it brings a certain joy. When I look at the flower, I feel happy. By putting it on my head or in the vase, I expand or extend that happiness or the joy. When you enter into a space which has been beautifully decorated with flowers, you can feel the shift that takes place in your consciousness. If the flowers are plastic, there is still the visual beauty which gives you a shift. If the flowers are living, then there is an energetic beauty also which gives you a shift. If the flowers are on the plants in the garden, you enter the garden and you feel a shift on all levels. And it is this which you're trying to capture. It is this which you're adoring, to which your heart pours out, or which you want to seize and extend or express in some other way. So He accepts the adorations of all beings. Unknown to us, every time we appreciate something, enjoy something, or seek out some joy in anything, we're actually reaching out to Him as joy and bliss. Each time we express joy, every time we try to create more beauty and happiness, unknown to us, we are adoring Him and bringing Him into form of expression. So just as works was fulfilling His will, just as our questing for knowledge was fulfilling discovery of Him, so too our seeking for joy or wanting to express joy is fulfilling Him by adoration of Him. Now think of it in this way. Everything in the universe is adoring the divine when it tries to express some joy or when it tries to seek some joy. In the most deep desire or drives within the human being, what do we seek for? We seek to know. We seek to act. We seek to enjoy. Of these three, which is more fundamental? Why do you want to know? Why do you want to act? Because it gives you joy. Each time you know more, you feel more joyous. Each time you act, you feel fulfilled in the action. Underlying everything is this secret joy that's working, fulfilling itself through everything. Unknown to us, the joy itself is conscious. The joy is trying to pour out of each form. The joy is filling your knowledge and you're seeking for knowledge. The joy is filling your will and you're seeking to express your desire or will. And so the picture he is bringing to us is the pouring of the joy emerging out of each form from behind so many layers secretly and wanting to pour out into him in other forms through so many layers. You see, just as the will emerged from so many layers and went into him in so many layers, the joy and the enjoyment emerged and went into him. So, we reread this sentence. the self-existent. The integral knowledge again reveals to us the self-existent as the all-blissful, who, as Satchidananda manifesting the world, manifesting all beings, accepts their adoration. Even as he accepts their works of aspiration and their seekings of knowledge. So everything in every action is really reaching out finally to realize him, adoring him in some way. So look at a person who is an atheist, no religion, no sense of God. What does he do? What is his drive? What is his passion? And somebody will say, I am working for justice in the world. I am working to discover the secrets of nature in my science, the scientist says. The artist says, I am trying to create works of beauty and art which no one has done before. The businessman says, I want to create an empire in which everybody can come and find something, and I will rule and control this grand empire in which everybody will find something worthwhile that they can do. All of these people secretly, unconsciously are really reaching out to adore the divine. The artist most obviously by worshipping beauty, but the one who's seeking for justice and working for justice and as an activist is also worshipping the divine as justice, as the will, his will which has to harmonize everything, bringing the right balance in everything. The businessman, to create his clientele, to make money or to satisfy the needs of so many, again to bring joy in some form, to bring fulfillment, to bring distribution of resources, to create experiences which didn't exist. And the scientist similarly. Everyone is serving finally the fulfillment of this joy and adoration of the divine through so many layers and appearances. But that's not the only relationship. If he accepts these adorations of all beings, he also, next step, leans down to them, coming close in the way that they can meet. What is this leaning down? An adult who is tall meets a child, a baby who's much shorter, 1/4 his height. The adult can reach out his hand and say, let's shake hands. Not very useful. What does he do? Instead, he crouches down to the level of the child. If he has to play with the child, he has to diminish his energy to match the energy or strength of the child. If you want to have fun, you shift your emotions and your intellect to match the same attunement with the child's current development, and then you can play. And through that play, you can draw him to grow into a higher knowledge, higher maturity and strength and other capacities. Every engagement of a teacher with a student is like that. You come to the level of the student's current understanding and then widen it out to whatever you are able to take to. When you cannot do any more, you hand over to another teacher who now takes the next. Or the student finds someone else. The one divine who is everything can of course take you all the way. But at first, in order to be able to engage so that you can recognize him or meet him, he has to lean down to your level and meet you there. If the worm meets this flower, it cannot appreciate the beauty of the form or the richness of colors. It can only smell and touch. And so it's as if the divine has to lean down to its current development of senses of smell and touch and give to it what it needs according to its nature. And that's the point where the divine leans down and then draws from there to expand and widen the capacities. Until at some point the worm has grown up to be a conscious moving creature with so many senses awakened and so on. There's a very beautiful line of Sri Aurobindo in one of his poems. Thou who disdainest not the worm to be, nor even the clod. You don't disdain the worm, oh this is too petty, or the mud, this is too muddy. And a few more lines, and then he says, therefore we know by that humility that thou art God. Only the one who is all can choose to become nothing in order to match the capacity of the nothing and meet there, and from there draw you up. So lean down to them. But what's the purpose of that leading? Third step, and drawing them to himself takes all into the joy of his divine being. What was the purpose of that leaning down? So that you may meet and engage. And what is the purpose of engaging? In order to draw. To what? To himself. And what is it that is himself? Take all into the joy of his divine being. That is what he is. And so every experience in the universe is the divine leaning down to you as you are in your current development, meeting you in that experience which is for you the most natural point of contact through which he can lift you, to draw you into his being of delight. Think of it this way. If you now relate yourself, you as an individual, and the whole universe, the rest of the universe and life as him. Every experience coming to you right now is him leaning down to meet you where you are in your current consciousness and your current state, and taking you from there one more step, and one more step, and one more step. You see the sense of this? You reread the line. The all blissful who, as Satchidananda manifesting the world, manifesting all beings, accepts their adoration, even as he accepts their works of aspiration and their seekings of knowledge, leans down to them, and drawing them to himself, takes all into the joy of his divine being. So on two levels this leaning down is taking place, as world, Satchidananda manifesting as world, and Satchidananda manifesting as all beings. So not only you see the whole world meeting you, the entire universe is the divine meeting you in your current development to draw you to his divine being, but through each form and each individual relation and experience, it is he reaching out to draw you to his divine being. And if you see it this way, of course obscurely, through so many layers, so you do not see him directly, and yet it is him. Drawing them to himself takes all into the joy of his divine being. In this sense, every experience that we have is hidden, hiding behind appearances. And you see now the analogy of the play of Sri Krishna and his Leela. We come back to an image we have drawn upon many times before. The gopis are the cowherds, the women working with the cows, drawing the milk, turning the milk into yogurt, converting the yogurt into butter, out of the butter preparing the clarified butter, the ghee. What is this process? Conversion of consciousness. Light, cow is illumination. The light concealed now, milk as one of its derivatives going through process. And what is the soul doing with each of these? It's drawing nourishment from each step. As you drink the milk, eat the yogurt, taste the butter, and so on. So these are individual souls in the normal flow of life, not knowing the source of the light, but playing with its derivatives and its concealed forms, churning them to extract something more essential, more refined, more true, and going through these many steps of transformation, of nourishment, and growing through it the slow way. Shri Krishna, as the Lord, is unknown to them. Or they look upon a child and say, oh, he is mischievous, we do not know him for the divine. He plays the flute of his call. And the call is heard by them and they are mesmerized. Their hearts yearn for this music, whose source they do not know, and which they have forgotten that they knew. When you hear the music, you remember something which you had forgotten, and you had forgotten that you knew it. But when you hear it, you remember, yes, this is familiar. This is what I want. This is what I yearn for. So a brief touch of that delight, but through some hidden way. And immediately when they hear the music, they forget what they are doing. They leave behind what they have. They are carrying a pot of milk, they walk in trance, and the pot slips from their head and falls. The things which were engaging them so far with so much hypnotic, mechanical, somnambulistic living, they now lose attraction because something more attractive is now felt, heard, but not yet seen. So they start looking. And how do you look? Where do you go? You don't know. You listen, perhaps it's from here, and you go in this direction, and you find it's not here, it's somewhere there. Perhaps it's here, and you wander, zigzag, but now you're consciously seeking. And at some point, when it seems like you're about to lose, you're about to give up, he peeks from behind the tree, and you have a glimpse of a feather, of his peacock feather, glimpse of his cloth, glimpse of a hand or a face, and you're enchanted by the glimpse, and he's gone. And now you run after rapidly because you know where. And again he is not there. And again a different zigzag, more rapid perhaps. Before you realize it, you are no more in the house where you were, but you're deep in the forest. You see how it works. The chasing, the zigzag movement takes you somewhere. I'll briefly digress from this image to play on this idea. I was once in Orissa for a program, and it was a big gathering. People had come, almost 3,000 people from all over Orissa, and they were reading, discussing Sri Aurobindo's works. And I had saw a brochure prepared of some program they had created, and it was, they would create an engineers association, doctors association, and so many other artists association, organize it, make rigid structures, and a whole group of youth who would be called Army of Light, and the oath that they would take and all the things they would believe, and it seemed so mechanical and artificial. And I said, this is not it, this is not how it should be. And it was my intention to at least drop a hint that this is not how it should be. I got up from my chair when it was my turn to speak. As I walked up to the podium, it was as if something fell from above, which I can only describe as a crystal piece. A piece from above broken, it fell and clink, clink, and it revealed, as if jeweled, many facets. And the whole thing opened out like a vision. And I saw what the mother intended for Orissa. And I could only describe it in these terms. What she was doing in Auroville, on the scale of a township, was being organized on the scale of an entire state. Actually, a state in India is as big as a country in Europe, both in space and in population. So as big as a country in most places of the world. And it was to create an economy which was based not on exchange of money and the conventional economic structure, but on trust and on giving and on sharing. And the framework of that was already there. The basis for that was the deep devotion that had been imprinted in the people going back 1,000 years. And particularly through the form of worship of Jagannath and all the things which came with it in the culture. And there was a whole preparation going back 1,000 years, and now a framework being organized. I'm shortening the whole thing because there was a rich detail in the whole thing. But the point was, nobody could see what she had intended because it was too far from their current conception of how things should be. So what do you do in such a case? Well, you allow people to work in their current conception. You can show them something, but it wouldn't make sense. And what was obvious was, the only way to go from here to there was make effort. And it doesn't matter what effort you make. And I saw that there was nothing in the consciousness of the people to be able to go from here to that because it was not there. But what was there was the ability to go round and round in the effort you make in your current understanding. And each time you make a round, she pushes you a notch and you end up a step above. And you make another round where you are and she pushes you a notch. And I'm getting to this point, which was, it didn't matter what effort they make, as long as they did it with devotion and love. With whatever ignorance, whatever confusion, whatever limitation, as long as they made effort, she would nudge inside their effort the direction which she intended, which they cannot see. They meaning all of us, all human beings. In our lives, we try to do what we want. We claim, want this, try, fight, struggle. All the time the divine will aims at something so much more simple and direct, but which we are unable to feel or see. But our effort is the base on which a nudge is given. And so I ended up saying this. I said, look, you have all these plans. Maybe none of it will work. Maybe some of it will work. It doesn't matter. Don't get stuck with the plans. Make the efforts. And do it with love, do it with devotion, and she will work through that effort to give it a nudge in the direction intended. And briefly I spoke about what the glimpse which was given. And this is what I'm pointing to here, that in our efforts something works. In our attempt to fulfill, that acts. So in the image we were looking at, as they wander looking for him, they don't know where he is. The call of the flute is not enough. But some yearning is there. They wander zigzag, but the nudge, each time. Until eventually, in the whole narration of this story, as the gopis eventually come to him, they are still themselves, remember. They have to bear themselves. They have to let go of everything. And so there is also the story of how he steals from them their clothing until they forget who they are. Bare-bodied, they meet him. The soul bared of all its pretenses, not only vices but also virtues are pretenses. And then we are able to, or we are ready to meet the divine. And the end of the journey is the play of the dance, where the dance of the gopis is around the Lord, because there is only one Lord, and yet he multiplies himself, and each finds himself uniquely dancing with him alone, while they dance together collectively. And this takes place under the moonlight, which is representing of the bliss. And this dance, this Leela takes place, it is an eternal dance taking place in Vrindavan, not in the physical plane, but in the higher worlds always. This is how Sri Aurobindo puts it. This image is profoundly indicative of this nature of human souls and our journey of life and the relationship with the divine. In spite of ourselves, he leans down to us, drawing us to himself, takes all into the joy of his divine being. This power of drawing, attracting, akarshana, the root is krish, is the root of the name Krishna, the one, the beloved who draws the whole cosmos to himself. Krishna also in Sanskrit is used to describe black because the color black absorbs all light, draws everything into itself. But it's not that Sri Krishna was black, it is rather the root sense of drawing, the magnetism drawing all. In Savitri, you will recall also this phrase Sri Aurobindo uses describing the Divine Mother, the magnet of our difficult ascent. We are struggling to grow. With our personal effort, we can only pull and push. We pull the rock above and push the rock below. But there's something else which lifts us in spite of ourselves, as if a magnet up there, it pulls you. And if you could align yourself to its field, its force, it can take you much more rapidly. And you use your hands only to guide, keep yourself in balance. This is the power of attraction. Leans down to them and drawing them to himself takes all into the joy of his divine being. This leaning down also reminds me of the mother when she was dealing with people. Each person as she met, you would find a complete shift in her form of expression. A serious person came, a sadhaka who has a very serious concentration on his practice, and she would meet him with a conscious, serious, stern relation as he needed. A child would come and she would become a child and play with the child, giving him chocolate or whatever, playing in this way. An ambassador of a country came and she got up from her chair, shook hands, made him sit on a chair and discussed politics or whatever it was of the person's interest. Each person coming, she adjusted herself to meet as best as the person could relate to her. Our conception of the divine necessarily is limited to whatever we are able to accept as divine. And so the divine must lean down to fit that image. Not entirely, because if it fits too perfectly, we will stop with the conception. So according to our readiness, he goes a little beyond our conception, breaks that conception on some edges. And we say, just enough that we can accept him for the divine, and then, oh yeah, but what about that? I can't accept this, but there must be something to it, and so I make a little effort to extend myself. And again he breaks out, and a little effort. And if you were to see the divine in his full scope, it is too overwhelming, too intense, too contradictory to your conception for you to accept. And that's the nature of the revelation that Sri Krishna gives to Arjuna, where he sees all extremes included, the most loving and gentle and harmonious to the more extreme and terrifying and horrible. And all these facets are forms of himself. And it is so overwhelming that he says, enough, I can't bear this anymore. Come back to your normal four-armed form of Vishnu, and that is for me more manageable. But this movement is slow, leaning down, drawing them to himself, and the process is as slow as you are able to adjust, as slow as you are able to adapt and grow. But eventually all are taken into the joy of his divine being. If you look at it this way, then our journey of evolution necessarily has to go from joy to greater joy, because we are growing always towards his Ananda. Why then do we experience not joy? Why do we experience conflict or pain and suffering and all the other things? We read from Savitri last time something of this, in fact several passages a few weeks ago, but from them I will selectively pick a few lines. This is from Savitri, page 454. Because afflicted by the little self, we are afflicted, we are almost like an illness bound to the little self. Thy consciousness forgets to be divine, as it walks in the vague penumbra of the flesh and cannot bear the world's tremendous touch. You see, we have forgotten our divinity. We are in this half shadow of the body awareness, because I am body, remember, can't bear the world's tremendous touch. At this moment, it is the entire universe impacting me, humongous, infinite, impacting me. If that impact is too intense, I get overwhelmed. Oh, I'm in pain, I'm suffering in life. If it is gentle, oh, I'm enjoying life, it is so nice and comfortable. But it is the touch of the whole universe which is and part of the all. Cannot bear the world's tremendous touch. Thou criest out and sayest that there is pain. Then he says, indifference, pain and joy, a triple disguise. Attire is dress. Attire of the rapturous dancer in the ways, capital D dancer. The divine as the dancer has put on all these clothings and layers, which are indifference, pain and joy, a triple disguise. Withhold from thee the body of God's bliss. This triple disguise of indifference, pain and joy, which are a dress covered by the dancer. Withhold from thee the body of God's bliss. If you could see through indifference, pain and joy, you would discover behind this clothing the body of God's bliss. And remember, he is speaking right now of the whole world. The dancer, capital D, and the touch of the whole world. Meaning, this whole world is the body of God's bliss. It is the bliss manifesting in whirl of conscious energy, taking on so many forms. Everything is substance of bliss, concealed behind this triple disguise. Now think about it in this way. What are you experiencing in your life? The body of God's bliss, but through masks. Each form has these layers. You yourself are masked, you have forgotten. He says, thy consciousness forgets to be divine. Why? Afflicted by the little self. And so you're struggling. But actually, all the time, secretly behind everything, this universe is the body of God's bliss. Withhold from thee the body of God's bliss. Thy spirit strength shall make thee one with God. Thy agony shall change to ecstasy. Indifference deepen into infinite's calm. And joy laugh nude on the peaks of the Absolute. This is the promise given. Because if this is the reality, if behind all concealments it is always the body of God's bliss, it's a question of time before these layers fall away. And then, later, after explaining how we entered this whole game, he says, a vast disguise conceals the eternal's bliss. And so this is what we are reading here. We discover the self-existent is also the all-blissful, who as Satchidananda manifesting the worlds, manifesting all beings, accepts their adoration, even as he accepts their works of aspiration and their seekings of knowledge, leans down to them and drawing them to himself, takes all into the joy of his divine being. So this is the first movement of the awakening. Second, knowing him as our divine self, we become one with him. As the lover and beloved become one in the ecstasy of that embrace. And the second movement is that we realize within ourselves, through the way of integral knowledge, that he am I, except that there is at first this sense of the difference, he and I. But what is he? He is the beloved. What am I? The lover. And we become one with him in the ecstasy of that embrace of the beloved and the lover meeting. Now this movement now, which earlier in the path of knowledge was seen as a merging of the separate I into the oneness, which in the way of works was seen as my will and consciousness joining his will and consciousness, here becomes the bliss of the meeting, of the union. And you can see what it fills upon the other two layers, what it brings as completeness of the whole sense of the purpose of the universe. If not for this aspect of the all blissful, if not for this sense of the lover and beloved in the ecstasy of the embrace, the whole exercise would be pointless. Because this is what we experience, this is what is the highest fulfillment of our awakening, everything is worthwhile. We chose to be able to separate so that we may be able to rejoin in the embrace of the lover and in the ecstasy of the embrace. And this is the inner subjective awakening. Knowing him too in all beings, this is now the relationship with him in different forms. Knowing him too in all beings, perceiving the glory and beauty and joy of the beloved everywhere, we transform our souls into a passion of universal delight and a wideness and joy of universal love. If once we have had this experience of the relationship within with the beloved, and then we see his face or his form, his presence in all beings, how do we relate to those beings? And this is the only relationship possible. So 3 steps have taken place. The first was where we saw the universe as a whole, as his form, and him leaning to us through everything and drawing us to himself in one gigantic whole of the universe in which the whole play takes place. The second was in our individual consciousness. So what was externally nature is now his front, drawing us back to him in his divine revealed form as body of bliss. Internally, subjectively, our consciousness uniting with him as the beloved, and then all the multiplicity of his forms which are in all things. And this relationship is a multiple relationship in the universal. So there's the universal, there's the individual, and then there is the multiplicity of the play of many forms. Knowing him too in all beings. So it does not mean that the criminal ceases to be a criminal, but we know him in the heart of the criminal. What then would be your relationship? In an example which I have narrated before, there was a person who came, this was in the 50s or 60s, when the mother was going to the playground in the 50s, and there was a person who came dressed in military uniform, and at that time, because India had just won her freedom, there was great respect for those who fought on the borders to protect the country from Chinese aggression, Pakistani aggression, and so military people were looked up to. And when he came and met the mother met him with a lot of love and tenderness, took him to the playground, and he was given a hero's welcome by the children. And the attention that she paid to him with so much love was unusual. And then soon after he went, there was an article in the newspapers that he had been impersonating as a military person to gain certain benefits, and he had been arrested for that. And so somebody asked the mother, "Didn't you know, mother?" She said, "Yes, when he came to me the first time, his soul leaped out and fell at my feet weeping, because it was trapped in a personality which was full of deception and impersonation." What do you do in such a case? If you relate to the soul within, what would be your relationship? She gave him all the love and affection, and then put in also the force to break the impersonation. So immediately after leaving Pondicherry, it was exposed and he was arrested. But she gave him all that was necessary also to survive that and to grow through it, effectively assisting the soul to break free of a distorted shell, but giving it the strength to suffer the passage also. When we see that in the thief, in the criminal, what would you do if you saw the divine presence of the beloved in their heart, well, you would still love the beloved, you would still do what is necessary to the form which is false on the surface, with love, with the same affection. Knowing Him too in all beings, perceiving the glory and beauty and joy of the beloved everywhere. We transform our souls into a passion of universal delight. So everywhere, no exception. In everything you find three things: glory and beauty and joy of the beloved. Glory. It's as if in every action the beloved somehow overcomes. Somehow that presides, that dominates, overwhelms everything contrary to it. It wins. First movement. And second is, as it wins, as it overcomes, there's a glowing out increasingly of His beauty. And the third movement, as the beauty is able to reveal itself, there is also the revealed joy. Until then, the joy is concealed, the beauty is withheld, and there is still a kind of a struggle where what is hidden is struggling to emerge. Again, the example of the flower is so apt as a symbol. When first the flower is a bud, you do not see flower, you see only the green covering. And there's a struggle of a bursting out of something within which is growing. And at the moment where it bursts, the first covering has to break apart. And then there is the increasing glory, and with the glory emerging, the beauty can reveal itself. And as the beauty reveals, the perfume of the flower and the joy spreads and fills the whole garden. And this is really the movement of evolution. In every form, the concealed divinity, struggling, eventually overcomes, emerges, reveals the beauty, and then the joy. In certain animals, you will see the joy is obvious. In certain animals, it's not so obvious. The elephant lumbering along, you don't see the joy as easily as perhaps the bird or the butterfly flitting. But if you see the behavior of the elephant, you just find it is a more complex form of joy. As in the human being, there is still a joy to be alive, but then it takes on all these complex forms because of the way the mind works, where you convince yourself you're unhappy and struggle with your unhappiness, but enjoy the struggle on some other level, and so on. So these three things he uses: perceiving the glory and beauty and joy of the beloved everywhere. We see that. And the result, our individual relation with them and our identity changes. We transform our souls into a passion of universal delight. If everywhere you look, it is only the beloved and His glory and beauty and joy, well, what do? You are overwhelmed by it. And there is this passion which draws you everywhere to all things. So universal delight. And the second thing with the universal delight is the wideness and joy of universal love. These two things are as if different. There's a universal delight. Perhaps you do nothing with it. The delight is there simply. The love is an expression of that delight which may take on unique forms. With the flower, it will be by smelling the perfume and enjoying it, or by offering it and placing it in an appropriate place to glorify its beauty further. With the little dog playing, it will be a different expression. And with another person, it will be a different form. And with the criminal, it will still be the love, but it will take a different form. And so, in each, the form of the love plays with a common underlying universal delight. So you see the relationship between these two. We transform our souls into a passion of universal delight and a wideness and joy of universal love. The love is universal, it plays differently in each form, and it embraces all things. All this, which as we shall find is the summit of the path of devotion, becomes also an annex and a result of the path of knowledge. Because our path of knowledge was broad enough that from the Sat, it also knew the Chit, Tapas and the Ananda as aspects of the triple Satchidananda. If we had taken a path of knowledge which was exclusive, cutting out the other two, then we would not know these, we would not have these results. And that's why the initial definition of the path is so important. We have seen throughout history many stories, many examples of yogis who took a very narrow path. The result of the narrow path was every time that there was a glimpse of something more, they cut out, because this is not my path. I recall reading an experience of a person I had met. He was earlier an IBM executive, businessman, technocrat, I don't know, and now living in New York, but deeply rooted in certain traditional practices. And he had a deep practice of meditation. At some point in his life, he participated in a retreat of a Chang Buddhist master, Chan master, which is one of the paths of Buddhism which not only aims at the nirvana but also at an embracement of life in the poise of nirvana. So there was something more to it. And so in this practice, when he was in the retreat, he wrote that experience. He said at some point in his deep concentration, they were meditating for 6 hours at a time, continuously. But he reached that poise in which he experienced an extraordinary bliss pouring. And he lived in that bliss. And after it was over, the Chan master, Master Shengyen, came to him and said, "No, that's not it. Don't stop here. You must go beyond that." And so when the experience came the second time, he said no and cut it out and went further. And then he says, "I don't know what happened. When I came out, I had no memory of anything. 6 hours had passed. That was all." And one would wonder, certainly in terms of the liberation, this was an important realization, an important experience. But to eliminate that bliss and consider it as something which belongs to the relative and to go beyond, whether it is perhaps for that path relevant, or at least in terms of the integral yoga, having transcended it, one would come back to re-embrace and discover all these as facets of that which is beyond description. Discover the Satchidananda and return to re-embrace life and the world from Satchidananda. But I point to this only because it is possible to cut out and take to an exclusive focus because you define that as your goal. And then whatever your methodology, whatever the nature of the experience it may give, you will always continue to cut to remain in that narrow passage. Sri Aurobindo deliberately, from the very beginning of the description of the yoga of integral knowledge, broadened everything. Broadened the definition of knowledge itself. Broadened the definition of the path. Broadened the definition of the goal. And even the means. And everything being broadened and made integral, it forms a starting point which is taking one aspect, but ends up in a realization which is inclusive. And so, the results of the way of devotion also becomes an annex and result of the path of knowledge. But what you have now in the description, through these 3 layers, you see how the triple experience of Satchidananda, first in the way you conceive of or know the world, the Sat underlying the whole, the Sat within you, Soham, the Sat behind supporting each I, And then the pouring of the life force, pouring of the consciousness glowing out in the whole cosmos, within you, in your individual will, and then through each will in the universe. And then the third layer of the delight of the Lord, accepting the aspiration and the adoration of all beings. And then within you, the same merging in ecstasy of union with the divine, and then discovering the Lord in all beings and relating to the divine in life in a universal delight and wideness and joy of universal love. This would be the basis on which a divine life would find its further possibilities. It's not yet divinized fully. You have only an experience of the divine in your consciousness and a relationship with the divine. But now there are parts still which are not able to express the divinity. The veil is removed, you see the divine, but the forms are not yet liberated from their limitation. And upon this will build then the yoga of self-perfection. And that is the phase of the divinization of life itself and of the consciousness and of all the activities and so on. Perception of the divine and relation to the divine is the base upon which this transformation of the form to reveal divinity rather than conceal divinity, that will take place. And it is that which will bring to the fulfillment of the integral yoga. But if you see the way he has formulated the whole journey, even if you begin with the aspect of knowledge, you have broadened to include all three results and created a base on which the transformation can begin. Thus, we come to the last paragraph now. Thus, by the integral knowledge, we unify all things in the one. Now, all things means everything. Not only underlying reality, not only the consciousness, not only the force, not only the relationships, everything. Nothing is left out. We unify all things in the one. We take up all the chords of the universal music, strains of sweet or discordant, luminous in their suggestion or obscure, powerful or faint, heard or suppressed, and find them all changed and reconciled in the indivisible harmony of Satchidananda. Now remember why this unification was needed, because they were still in the structure of the cosmos two levels. There was the revealed Satchidananda in the upper half of the cosmos and the concealed Satchidananda in the lower half of mind, life and matter. Through this process which he has described, we discover, remove the covering of the Satchidananda in mind, life and matter. We now glimpse the Satchidananda working in and through all these forms. And so we have healed the upper half and the lower half of the cosmos. We see one only across all. So that's why we unify all things in the one. What happens then in the play of the forms, in the play of these movements, comes this image of the music. We take up all the chords of the universal music. Chords, when you have multiple notes playing together. Strains, sweet or discordant, are also taken up. So, a strain of music is a single movement in the chords which continues for a while. If it is harmonized, it is sweet, or if it is in disharmony, you feel a tension between the notes, but it's a strain. Luminous in their suggestion or obscure, every piece of music as it comes suggests something more which it represents behind or which is going to point to next. Or the suggestion may be revealed or it may be hidden. Powerful or distant, whole orchestra flows upon you or you hear it far away somewhere calling. Heard or suppressed, The music is there, you may not always hear. It's so well covered up, you do not hear it. And find them all changed and reconciled in the indivisible harmony of Satchidananda. Now if you see this image that he has used, the metaphor of the music being played, why has he taken to this? But we'll come to that shortly. In the metaphor of the music, all the variations of human experience are now covered. Remember the example we took of the criminal. Inside you see the divinity and then the layers of concealment and distortion. The flower which is still blooming, the music is hidden inside the bud, not yet coming out. If you listen to it, it's distant or it's weak. And as the flower blooms, the music comes forward and reveals itself intensely. Why has he used this analogy of the music? If you look deeply at the nature of the universe, you will discover that the one thing which is common to everything is vibration. You go deep, layer by layer. What do you see first? Okay, here are petals, then there are molecules, then there are atoms. Notice, okay, the petals are moving a little bit in the wind. Molecules are vibrating. You have heard of this, forget the term now with a B, Brownian motion. If you observe a molecule or an atom, anything under the microscope, you see everything shaking lightly. You heat it up, it shakes more. But it's shaking. You can never stop the shaking. It's as if it's part of the nature of the movement of energy. You go down further, the whole atom is whirling. But what is the whirl itself? A rhythm. You go down further into the subatomic particle and you see it pulsating. Interestingly, as you approach in quantum physics, the borderline of form, you discover everything has a frequency. The electron, which so far we had conceived of as a bubble or a little marble-like round ball, is now a pulsating frequency of energy. And it has a frequency called the Compton frequency. And the shift of the frequency is the shift of the energy of the electron and the quality that it expresses. Every layer after that is only frequencies of waves of energy. When the frequencies of waves are free-flowing, you experience it as a force. When the frequencies of waves are cyclic and repeating, you experience it as an object or a particle or a structure because it repeats itself. That's all there is to everything. In the way the physics then works with reality, it deals only with frequencies. So one of the things you discover is the energy is made up of so many frequencies. Every possible frequency at the same time. How much energy is it? Infinite. So for practical reasons in the quantum chromodynamics or quantum electrodynamics, you cut off the top and cut off the bottom to make it finite. Otherwise it would be infinite energy, infinite frequencies. Bring it into some range which is manageable. And then you deal with humongous numbers of energy in a little cube of empty space. Energy, frequency, all is one gigantic orchestra. There are giant waves spanning the entire universe in a single sweep. And then there are smaller waves within those spanning an entire galaxy. And within that there are waves spanning cycles within the galaxy and your little pocket of a local cluster of stars, 12 to 13 stars typically. And within that, for each star, there are cycles which you see in the rhythms of the sun pulsating. The sun has cycles which span thousands of years in which it expands and shrinks like a heart beating. And then it has cycles of much smaller workings of its magnetic field flipping every 11 years. And nobody knows why. And if scientists tell you they know what the sun is made of or how it works, don't believe them. We don't know something so simple. Why the magnetic field flips, or how it flips, or how it is formed. Nothing. and it's pulsating. Everything is pulsating. The earth itself, when you watch from space, of course you have to photograph it across many years. There are some images you will see of animation. The pulsation of the seasons from the north and south pole. In the north you see the increase of the ice, snow, and the south you see shrinking, and then back and forth, pulsating. Interesting. And everything of the whole atmosphere is expanding and contracting. And there are small cycles, annual cycles which are across centuries. And then cycles which are 25,000 years. And then cycles which are millions of years. Everything is pulsating energy waves. And that's why we also use this vocabulary when we speak of states of consciousness. They are like frequencies, because we seem to be able to tune in, tune out. We seem to be able to shift a state, except that the normal concept of one-dimensional frequency fades out. Instead, it is a vibration of consciousness. And you meet somebody and you tune to their vibration. And when you tune, you feel the link, the connect. You tune out and you are out of sync. Everything is consciousness tuning in. If you concentrate on somebody or something or a state of consciousness and tune in until you match it, you experience contact with it. You are in relation or contact with it. It's as simple as that. You can tune in to your own higher aspirations until you begin to live them. You can tune in to an object which is far away in the universe, and you'll find yourself in consciousness approaching and touching it. Everything is tuning fields of vibrations. Now you come to this image he has taken. The harmony of Satchidananda. Satchidananda is this gigantic movement of all these frequencies, rhythms, perfectly harmonized in the totality. And this he describes as the indivisible harmony of Satchidananda. Of that, this universe is an outburst, like a gigantic orchestra. Every tiniest subatomic particle is an instrument. And then you have clusters of instruments. So you never hear one single strain, you have always a chord, combinations of them. If there is one single strain, it is actually a combination of many united to give you the sense of a single strain. And so a cluster of particles which make up for an atom is a chord. A cluster of atoms which make a molecule is another chord, more complex, more rich. The petal is one chord. The flower, you could say, is a sub-orchestra of the whole orchestra. And so the imagery now takes on a sudden vivid form. What you have is this particular chord and that chord are not in sync. Or within this chord, some of the notes are out of sync. And you say, this flower is slightly defective. You see some of the petals here, they're not exactly in harmony with the others. See, this is sticking out, that is sticking out. Yes, there is a discord. You put back the petal to the way it was, it should have been, and now it's back into perfect harmony. So what's happening to our experience of the universe? We experience discords everywhere, things out of sync, and all these are changed and reconciled in the indivisible harmony of Satchidananda. In the Satchidananda, you cannot divide anymore these separate ones. They all merge into a single movement of a rich, complex music. As you move out of the Satchidananda, through the many layers of concealment, you have differences. And these differences are now out of sync somehow. What are the various kinds of misalignments? We take up all the chords of the universal music. So you have chords, and then you have strains, sweet or discordant. This part is in harmony, that is out of harmony. Luminous in their suggestion or obscure. This reveals what it wants to say, that one conceals what it wants to say. Powerful or faint. Heard or suppressed, but they're still there. and find them all changed and reconciled in the universal harmony of Satchidananda. Suddenly everything falls into this perfect alignment. And yet things can be hidden, things can be far, things can be in discord, but they are in alignment. The knowledge brings also the power, capital P, and the joy. And then he quotes from the Isha Upanishad, when the Isha Upanishad says in the culminating experience, when you are one with the movement of the divine manifesting, the whole manifestation is yourself. Then it says, how shall he be deluded? Whence shall he have sorrow who sees everywhere the oneness? And with this he ends the paragraph. Now you see here the last analogy of the music is what he has also used elsewhere, because it is something so true in its origin. In the passage also which we had read perhaps last time or earlier, love is the keynote, joy is the music, power is the strain, knowledge is the performer, the infinite all is the composer and the audience. We know only the preliminary discords which are as fierce as the harmony shall be great. You see, as intense is the discord, that intense you will find the harmony later. But we shall arrive surely at the fugue of the divine beatitudes. And this is from Thoughts and Glimpses. With a similar symbolism he uses of the music. But the music aspect comes only once you have the ananda that has filled in. Until then you had the rigid structure, and then into it the movement of the play and the unfolding of the consciousness. And then comes this ananda and the music. And with it the delight and the love and the joy and the power. You can pause here and take up any comments, questions. I couldn't hear. Can you repeat?
How much free will we have when we pray? It's predetermined.
Yes.
Yes. We will only to speed up the process of ascension or slow it down. The rest is
Yes.
moving to itself.
Yes. When you look at the human being formed by nature, like an automaton, into which he has put an impulse. So if you see the working of our body, of our mind, it's almost pre-programmed. You can play with it to a precision which is amazing. You inject a certain chemical, the body will experience heat. You inject another chemical, the person will grow to be angry. You radiate the person with certain frequencies, the person will become very docile and helpful. You can program a person literally. Except that you find every now and then the programming breaks. We discover something inside which occasionally feels resistant to the programming and pushes back. And we discover that nature had planted a certain will, but she also planted a seed of freedom. Or let's say the seed of freedom came with the soul that took on this formation that nature created, but nature permits that as part of the play. I say nature planted it because even without the soul, in the single cell, nature has planted in the will of the cell to survive and a possibility for the cell to exercise its freedom to overcome certain limitations, but within a narrow groove. In the human being, because of the soul, that freedom is much larger. It can not only overcome the immediate challenges, it can overcome its programming, aim for something beyond its short-term programming. It can also override and reprogram itself. Now the question is, which is stronger? Is the outer habitual nature bundle stronger, or is the light of the soul stronger? In the beginning, the outer bundle of programming is the strongest, and the soul is sitting inside and watching and enjoying. Aha, this is interesting, this is interesting. It can be half asleep and say, oh yeah, that's interesting, and it grows. And as it grows, occasionally it says, yes, this is interesting, but this is dangerous. And it puts out an impulse, corrects something. Momentarily that person is confused or distracted, or suddenly an idea comes in and says, but what about, and it goes in a different direction. It's saved from a dangerous situation. And it exercises its freedom occasionally. At some point the soul says, okay, now I've had enough, let me take a more direct control. And it starts exercising a greater action. What may happen though is from outside there may be a pushback. The person in the upbringing now has been brought up to be extremely rigid and programmed in their nature. Now it used to be in the older days that people who grew up in noble families would be sent to special training schools where from childhood they were drilled into the structure of nobility of society. And a large part of that was to conform to certain standards. And the rigidity that it created in the personality was often suffocating. They hardened you. They made you desensitized to certain things so that you may fulfill certain roles, and so on. The result was, of course, the inner being, even if conscious, was now unable to exercise its influence and was suffocating. If it is strong enough, it can push hard and crack the personality, which of course creates imbalances and other problems. Or if it cannot, it may call for help, and from outside in life a knock comes which suddenly breaks and exposes the insufficiency of this, and the person is forced to grow out of it. More often than not, there are blows from outside. Occasionally, if there is a gap, it pushes forward and changes and guides. When the outer personality grows sufficiently conscious and says, but all my most wonderful things which I seek are already within me, and I will find my harmony and resolve my internal conflicts if I align myself to my center, and it starts making that effort, then the soul finds a supportive personality. And there is a double movement from in to out and out to in joining. And then the soul can begin to come forward and take charge and assert its freedom and then lead its life directly from then on. But all depends on where you are and what kind of distortions are in the outer nature. So put in summary, as you approach the soul center, you have greater freedom. As you bind yourself in mechanical nature, you have less freedom.
As in 56, the consciousness descended on this planet, so the mother says it passed to the hippie movement was in 60s, where we did like trial period. Is it through the 2012? Another consciousness descends, so we are waiting that one unreal and
from a spiritual perspective, what you are describing as ascension and the awakening, it's happened in 1956. It's done already. The rest of the process is an unfolding of that action, which necessarily has to be graded, otherwise a too direct action would shatter things. But if it is working from all directions at the same time, it is able to coordinate and somehow push things to speed up as quickly as possible with the least damage. But damage there will be where there is resistance. So we are now seeing from that point especially a double movement, a breakdown of things which refuse to change, and a rapid awakening of things which were inconceivable. And you have both movements happening, and because of that, almost as if in humanity a split. Mother spoke of this in the 1960s. She said that humanity will undergo a kind of a division. The part that accepts to change and grow will grow more and more rapidly, and the part that refuses to change will even fall back slightly to a level which is no more sustained by the push of nature or of evolution, and then stagnate to form a layer of humanity which will be intellectual and rational, but like the monkey will be obsolete as far as the cutting edge of evolution is concerned. And so we see that happening very distinctly now. And one of its forms is extremes of everything, divisions everywhere, and the kind which seem irreconcilable unless you make an effort to reconcile. It's not obvious that you can reconcile unless you're willing to let go of a narrow viewpoint and accept a larger perspective and make an effort. And so that's itself is indicative that something radical is breaking out. What remains in our hands is collectively whether this passage of awakening we participate consciously or not. And Mother used this phrase, whether humanity will need the force of crashing circumstances to awaken or not. And that, she says, is, at that point she said, it's still in the balance. And now, and now. It seems to be, but one has to, of course, go on a subjective level here. It seems to be that for a long time we had not much hope in the collective consciousness. Individually, of course, and in collections of individuals, yes, there's always that hope. But what we saw in the global system was such a deep entrenchment, such a deep rigidity, binding and holding, locking everything, refusing to change, and so deeply entrenched that there was no hope of breaking without a very powerful shattering impact, which then would have been inevitable. What we see now is some possibility that it might happen without need for that shattering. There are sudden shifts taking place in bursts in many different directions, and at some point they may synchronize suddenly and make for a broader possibility. And so that's just on the edge as it's happening right now. And so there is always that hope.
And there's always hope, that's true. And especially it will go forward, it won't go backwards. But what happens also with countries, she said about certain countries who are not open, they're really, she used a certain term, or
Yes.
she said if countries are not ready to make the progress and so on. So I was wondering, like if I see now Turkey, for example, or if I see the movement in the East, you know, going to racism and going to
Yes.
very conservative values back and all that. So are these countries then not ready? What will happen to
Yes.
these countries?
In my experience, and I had occasion to have visited now more than 30 or 40 countries all over the world, and fortunately in all these visits I had a contact with people in the spiritual interest groups. So it's as if one gets there a glimpse of what is the high point of that country. And what I saw is our sense of what comes through the media does not match what's actually happening in the grassroots. You may see, for example, a space like Brazil or Venezuela going through, from the media, political problems, economic problems, or whatever, social strife. But what you see in the people there is something quite exceptional. there is an extraordinary aspiration, even an opening to a spiritual light, but somewhat mixed by what it understands of spirituality. But it's so clear and so awake that one may see there a more rapid progress, if that comes forward, than in other spaces which you may find to be economically well developed, politically stable, and so on. So in consciousness terms, it's not always obvious from the media descriptions of which country is really growing or awake. Sometimes it's happened that a country is awake, but the organization of the political, military, economic structures are so rigid, they are holding back. But internally there's a huge awakening taking place. And this will lead to a revolution, a cracking of the shell and a breaking out. And it will be drastic, perhaps painful. But in consciousness terms, you may say this country is actually more ready to wake up than somewhere else where everything is nice and neat, but people are asleep because they don't aspire. So sometimes even oppression is useful to trigger that aspiration to wake up. Which was the interesting example I share of Egypt. And we happened to be there. I was part of a group just after that huge demonstration in the square, Tahrir Square was it? And it was just 2 weeks after that we went there, and we even visited that square. And the thing was still vivid. It was as if there was a huge light which had descended and awoken people. And when we heard from them what happened, they were saying, we lived in a different world. It was as if the beauty of the future which is waiting, we were living in it. We were all brothers and sisters. We were all friends, one family, one humanity. All these descriptions which came through, and this light in their eyes when they were describing that state. And then suddenly the police came and began to shoot, and it took a different form politically. But that thing which came, you could feel still the imprint of that light. And of course the dark resists, and so there's this back and forth. But if you looked at that, and at least among those people who experienced it, there was so much readiness. And then they went back to half sleep, but the memory is still nudging. And so it's happening everywhere. What is interesting is the action of the supramental force uses whatever you may do against it to speed up evolution. The harder the resistance you offer, the more it will build up the pressure inside for a sudden breakthrough. And if you are simply open, then it will infiltrate through many other forms and interests. And one of the forms through which it is infiltrating everywhere is yoga. Yoga as gymnastics, exercise, health, whatever way it is propagated, but inevitably leads to something more, an awakening of consciousness, awareness, and possibilities of higher things. And where I've watched, for example, a space where there was no yoga access, and then suddenly it was allowed. Within about 2 years, those who have been in the practice suddenly say they've changed so much. I give an example of a person who was working as an activist for the African Americans in the United States with all kinds of political, social and economic activism. He would carry a gun because he was in a space where people had guns, anyone could shoot anybody. The police could just come and grab you, beat you up, shoot you, anything. And as an activist, he carried a gun. And then he said he was going through all kinds of things, including alcohol and other problems, which were part of his life. And then he said, I started yoga, and a year later, everything was cleaned out. He said, I'm thinking more clearly, I'm feeling different, my relationship with everyone is different. And he said, I don't carry a gun anymore. He's still working in the most extreme criminal spaces, and no need for a gun anymore. You see? And he changed, it took him 1 year of yoga practice. That was the trigger point. So it's happening everywhere in some ways. I want to make this comment. What the supramental force is doing in spite of whatever resistance is there, is to expose everything. Nothing is going to be secret anymore. This was one of the characteristics the mother spoke of the action of the supramental force. She said, a day will come when you will not be able to keep anything secret. This particular facet of its working is going to be the way by which the entrenched interests will be dissolved. When suddenly you will discover that the people whom you trusted, the people who controlled power, the people who controlled the economy or the politics or whatever else, who taught you that, or the religions, who taught you that they were the ones worthy of trust, suddenly you discover that it's the opposite. And then there will be a radical shift, and it will be sudden. You see this in the exposes taking place currently in the church, and recently so many 300 cardinals in the US were found to be in exploitation of various kinds. And all over the world, the numbers of exposures like this are increasing. And that's one of the ways by which the transition is being made. If it's too sudden, it will disrupt society. And so it has still to be graded, but as quickly as possible. Yes.
So I'm also thinking of the four asuras or three, normal three, and they have to sort of give up their body and, like in Savitri, dissolve into the light and become what they really are in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And there may be some who may not want to do this, and then they dissolve in the light and they give up their body and they have no more incarnations, they have no more, also the people, they have no more way of connecting here, they just disappear. What will happen to those who will resist so much or who cannot make it, who cannot to the people want?
The way it works in human terms, if you resist and oppose, the crushing pressure breaks down that which is resisting and opposing. When it breaks down, the substance from which it was made, of course, comes back in a new form. So the same people will take birth again, and there's an opportunity for growth of some kind again, and of course with the backlog of the confusion that they have themselves already created. Those who simply refuse to participate, well, they kind of slide into obsolescence, and it doesn't matter anymore. They are there or not there, it doesn't make any difference to the evolutionary movement, and the evolution moves on. So we're looking at it purely from the perspective of individual souls in evolution, and there, of course, you always come back with a new possibility. Even those who have been instruments for Asuric forces, they are part of that process of awakening to realize that this was wrong. The Asuric beings themselves who may incarnate, who are not part of the evolution, Mother spoke of this in this way, that those who are attracted to interfere or enter earth affairs, human affairs, are the ones who are destined for change. So if not now, eventually even those beings have to recognize, and till then they play a role. They play a role of the opposition, and also as censors who test, who ensure that whatever harmony and strength and knowledge one builds is tested and made more perfect by the role that they play. And that's the only way in which we have to take it. Not to concern ourselves too much with the opposing dark or Asuric forces, and rather align with what Mother declared, there are no hostile forces. This is what she told Kirit, and she repeated it twice with force. And we treat them only as censors. Every time you find an opposition or disruption, observe what is it that you need to correct for. Increase in knowledge, increase in discrimination, increase in strength, increase in faith, increase in what is it that you lack, and correct for it and move on. Thank them for their intrusion or help, but not obsess with it. That's the better way. If you look at it from this perspective, that all as harmonies of the Satchidananda underlying, then even the so-called Asuric beings, they are serving an important function in the play, and you see behind their mask for the role that they are playing. So to close with the quotation, all these are reconciled in the indivisible harmony of Satchidananda, and the knowledge brings also the power and the joy. How shall he be deluded? Whence shall he have sorrow who sees everywhere the oneness? So to align ourselves to this vision is much more helpful and assists in the speeding up without needless frictions and conflicts. So next time we will begin the next chapter, which is the soul and nature, for which the first line is, "This is the result of the integral knowledge taken in its mass. Its work is to gather up the different strands of our being into the universal oneness." So it summarizes all that has been done over many chapters. All the strands of our being are gathered into the universal oneness. It's not a narrow oneness, universal oneness. And then we see what he will take us to next.